Faster than a speeding bullet.
I ran until my muscles burned and my veins pumped battery acid.
More powerful than a locomotive.
An idea is like a virus. Resilient. Highly contagious.
Able to leap tall buildings in a single bound.
Hey guys, Jared Moon here from Into 3 Fitness, and welcome to the Better Humanology podcast. This week, I'm talking to Zach Bitter. Now, he is an endurance athlete and coach. Really, he's an ultra marathon runner, so doing those super long distances when it comes to endurance training. So, like I said, he's an endurance athlete and coach, and he's very driven to find his limitations in a variety of environments, and he's also very passionate about helping other people find theirs. And it was a fascinating conversation because we talk about everything from just ultramarathon running to how he prepares mentally, how he prepares physically, what the training actually looks like. And we also dive into nutrition because he has a very unique approach, what he deems as metabolic flexibility, where he does this cycling of ultra low carbohydrate diet, and then he kind of swings that up to a more moderate but still low carb diet in his training, and when he does that, why he does that, how he does that, all of those things. So very, very interesting stuff. I found it very fascinating. A lot of information I can use to further program for endurance athletes, not just in the training realm, but especially in the nutrition side of things, which has helped me a lot. So Zach Bitter really knows what he's talking about, guys. He's a world and American record holder, 3-time national champion in the world 100-kilometer team USA. So it's not just like some random endurance athlete. This guy knows what he's talking about, and it was a really fun conversation. So I won't ramble on any further. Here is Zach Bitter. All right, Zach, I'm super pumped to have you on the Better Humanology podcast, man. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's exciting to be on the show.
All right, we're gonna start with some challenges for me and for the listeners, if you don't mind. So, can we kick it off with a fitness challenge?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to make it a little unique because it's one thing that I kind of at times have been guilty of is a lot of times we focus on some of the primary workouts, whatever sports or activity we're training for, and then quickly kind of put some of those tertiary things that kind of keep us healthy and keep us really in a good spot to continue to enjoy whatever activity we're doing. So I'm gonna challenge the listeners to focus on like mobility work as something to kind of prep a workout or something to do to kind of keep your body in a more like natural state or a better state to be able to kind of execute some of the more key workouts or specific workouts.
I think that's great. Not always focusing on the major, but getting into some of that minor stuff that really keeps us healthy. I think that's very important. All right, man. How about a mental toughness challenge for everybody listening?
Mental toughness challenge. I'm going to say just a little generic, but try something new. Try something different that you consider a weakness as opposed to a strength. And I can give an example for that. For me, it's yoga. I've never really, I guess, could say I've enjoyed yoga, but I've avoided it in the past because I know I'm not that good at it. But by going and doing it, you really identify like, okay, here's a weakness of mine. What am I going to do to address that, as opposed to kind of ignore it and rather than just always focusing on the strengths or the things we're really good at, try to focus on something that's your biggest weakness and give it a try. And then, sometimes what you find out if you do it enough, since it is a weakness, you tend to grow kind of fast at it because you just haven't been addressing it. So that's my fitness challenge. Pick something that you're weak at, or sport or an activity you're weak at, and try it a couple times and kind of see what happens. All
right, awesome. And the last one for you, man. How about a book recommendation?
I'm going to go with a book called Once a Runner. It was one of my favorite books that I read when I first started to kind of get into like competitive running in college. And it's just a really, really easy read. It keeps you kind of on the edge of your seat and interested.
And what was like your favorite thing about that book?
I think I just really liked the way they kind of built up to the end to it. It was like they would tease you just enough with some things along the way to keep you interested. And at the end, it really kind of, I don't want to spoil it if someone wants to read it, but it really kind of has a really really cool, motivating ending that'll make you want to get out and like work hard at whatever you're trying to focus on.
Well, now that I'm on the edge of my seat, I'll have to read it, man. I definitely add that to my list. All right, dude, I really do appreciate you doing the challenges and the book recommendation. But how about let's hear a little bit more about you. If you could provide some background and what you're doing today.
Yeah. So I'm I guess an extreme endurance athlete that focuses on ultra marathon running. It's been, I guess it's the type of sport that I don't think too often you really just decide one day you're going to be an ultra marathon runner. But I think it's kind of something that, at least for me, just kind of like I kind of grew into it, so to speak. I started running back in middle school when I found out that I could either get my butt kicked in the 100-meter dash or I could, win the 1600-meter. And that was kind of what I guess sparked interest in distance running for me. And then, I competed in high school and college for cross country and track and field. And, one thing I learned from that experience was that I tended to get a little better as the distances got longer. So after college, I started gravitating to some longer distance races. And then, when I did my first ultra marathon in 2010, I was pretty hooked. And then it just kind of slid into that as being the kind of the primary sport I was training for, like, basically distances from 50 kilometers. I've gone up to 200K, but more often than not, 100-mile is kind of a focus point distance that I like to try to target on a yearly basis.
Wow, that's incredible. 100-mile. So your furthest race you said is 200K?
Yeah, I did a 200-kilometer event, or actually it was they have these events. The ultra marathon running is kind of goofy where it's a small enough sport that they don't really compartmentalize too much, because then it would be making like a niche sport an even smaller niche. So they kind of lump everything into one category, whether it's like a 50K in the mountains, or sometimes people do these things called these timed events that go up to like 6 days where you see how far you can run in that time frame. And the event I did, the 200K, it was actually a 24-hour timed event on a track. And I didn't do the full 24 hours, but I did the 200 kilometers and set an American record for 200 kilometers on a track.
Wow, so that's a quarter-mile track?
Yeah, just your basic like high school or collegiate stadium track. So about as monotonous as it can get, but it's also what I would consider almost as pure to running as you can get, because you don't have to really think about anything but putting one foot in front of the other. Yeah,
that's crazy, man. So my first and only marathon I did on a quarter-mile track, and man, for me, I'm not really a runner, but I'm fairly decent at it. That was a mental toughness push or challenge right there. Just because, like you're saying, you just got on that track going over. I can't even imagine doing it for that distance. That's crazy, man.
Yeah, there's really no hiding on a track. You see exactly what's going right and going wrong on a 400-meter basis. So it's a different mental approach than I would say like a trail 100-miler, which are great in their own right, but the approach is a little different from the mental side of things.
And speaking of mental side of things, that's one of the topics I kind of wanted to cover with you, because I personally I do, a lot of strength training. I just try to be really well-rounded in my personal fitness. But anytime I really want to push myself mentally, I always go to some form of endurance, because I just feel like it kind of, to use your words, there's nowhere to hide in some of these endurance events, and you just have to keep going and keep pushing yourself. It's a lot different than trying to push yourself in a super intense 5 or 10 minute workout. You have to keep going and keep pushing yourself. How you kind of touched on the fact that you picked it up in middle school, or as a middle school runner, you're competing in the 1600 and then going into cross country in college and all of these things. Have you noticed any sort of, I'd say, mental development along these lines, or have you developed any strategies to cope with the mental toughness needed to run at these extreme endurances, but keep, a significant pace? Have you noticed anything over the last almost decade now?
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you're working with endurance events, whether it's the shorter end of endurance stuff like 3K, 5K distances, or some of the longer stuff like 100 milers, you're dealing with some of the same variables, but then they kind of start to kind of prioritize differently depending on what the distance is, and it's kind of to some degree it's a kind of a pick your poison. If you want that kind of more short acute pain, you do the shorter stuff, and if you want that kind of slow developing like prolonged pain, then you kind of do the longer stuff. And the way you mentally approach something like that, I think, is a little different. And it's certainly something that I've worked on developing and learning from, and I still am very much trying to continue to improve on it. But with a 100-mile distance, it's one of those things where I think it's kind of far enough from what like your normal mindset would be considered as like reasonable. So you kind of have to compartmentalize your thoughts and focus on things and really work on getting in that state of like being in the moment and focusing on a small goal rather than trying to wrap your head around the 100-mile distance as one thing, especially on the early stages, because the last thing you want is to be at mile 5 and start thinking, well, I got 95 miles to go. And, it's a lot easier to kind of just, pick little benchmarks along the way. And it ranges in difficulty. Sometimes, like, if you haven't done one in a while, I know I kind of experienced this because I just did a 100-miler about a week and a half ago, and it was the first 100-miler I'd done in about a year. And I kept having to remind myself in the last half of that race, like, focus on the small goals along the way and try to keep myself from kind of drifting into like, well, I'm at mile 62. That means I've got 38, and trying to wrap my head around too much. So kind of getting into that kind of state of flow where you're not necessarily overthinking things, or not necessarily trying to think of too much at once, where you're going to overwhelm your brain, which, at that point in a 100-mile race is already trying to convince your legs that they can't go any faster, or maintain whatever pace you're doing. And, it becomes a very, very big piece to the puzzle.
And is there anything that you do to reach that flow state? I mean, let's say leading up to one of these races, are you have any pre-ritual stuff or something you're doing during the race? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I've got a couple different tricks that tend to work well for me, and I've done a lot of flatter ultra marathons the last couple of years. So, one thing I'll do when I'm like on a track or on a flat road or something like that is, I'll try to like picture myself running a shorter route that I'm very familiar with, and then kind of picture where I would be on that route, and that kind of puts me in that state of thinking of just that smaller section as opposed to the whole thing. And I definitely try to do like course specific training, because that's going to be, if you get your body very routine with that type of environment, it's going to be easier to let your mind kind of drift into that comfort zone or that flow state, as opposed to like having to be constantly firing and responding to new stimulus. So like, and that's where it really diverges in the types of events you're doing. Because if you're doing like a mountainous 100-miler, that's going to be a little bit of different exposure to your body and your mind as, a 400-meter track. So for myself, I'm preparing for a track event in just over 4 weeks. So what I'll do before I kind of start to taper is I'll get on the track a lot and kind of, practice running the pace I want to hit, and being able to kind of like separate myself from my own thoughts, or like thinking about, too much in advance, and putting myself kind of in those positions, so that when I do get to the race itself, it kind of just gravitates towards that, as opposed to me having to try to force it.
And so what does the training look like for these ultra marathons? Because the like you said, the distances can vary, and so can the terrain. You could be in the mountains one day or on a track. Are you always changing your training just leading up to the event, like event specific training, or do you kind of have like maybe a generic training schedule that you stick to, and then you kind of throw in things to help prepare for a certain event?
Yeah, I would say when I'm really targeting a specific race, the first thing I do is I look at the profile, and I try to find a way to get on terrain like that for a lot of my runs and a lot of my workouts. Because I think especially as the distance gets longer, the specificity becomes more and more important. So then I kind of start to structure a training block around it. And the way that looks is, from a philosophical standpoint in endurance running, I'm a big believer in developing a really, really strong aerobic base before you start putting in any like real specific workouts. So I'll spend, usually it's anywhere between, depending on how fit I am coming into the training block. Sometimes I'm, like coming in after like a lot of rest. Other times I'm coming in, still holding on to a decent amount of fitness from a previous training block. But I'll usually kind of focus on a couple of metrics to kind of gauge where I'm at in that aerobic development. And that's my pace at a given heart rate, or I should say my pace at a given rate of perceived exertion. So what I like to see and what I like to look for in like my coaching clients is that pace at a given heart rate or at a given rate of perceived exertion kind of start to drop. And once that metric stops dropping and starts to plateau, that's when I start to kind of consider that aerobic development has peaked out, or that, you've hit that point in your base mileage training to kind of be ready to take on some more intensity work. And then I'll start bringing in some more workouts that are specific to to the race itself. And, a lot of times that'll be like, tempo runs or progression runs, or like interval workouts, hill repeats, that type of stuff. Those are the type of workouts that I kind of see as unsustainable year round. So I like to be a little more picky about when I use those. And what I found in my own training and in some of my clients is that when you have that really strong aerobic base developed, you don't have to do as many of those intensity workouts. So then you minimize those unsustainable workouts, and you tend to be a little more healthy and a little more fresh, I think, when you come into the race itself.
So I just want to make sure I understand. So to build that aerobic base that aerobic base, you do a lot of just say aerobic work, but you are finding kind of that almost that plateau point of the pace you can keep at a given heart rate, and then once that starts to decline, that's when you realize that you've kind of peaked at that aerobic fitness level. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I can give an example. So for like myself, I'll usually target like a heart rate around 150 to 155. And, when I'm starting a training block, I might be running like a 640 pace on a flat, like relatively cool day. And then as I get more and more developed aerobically, that'll start to drop. And then usually for me, if the environment is held constant, I can get down like just under 6-minute mile pace at that same heart rate. So then once I kind of get to there and I start to kind of plateau at that point, that's when I know that I've kind of fully developed that aerobic base and I'm ready. I have that foundation in place to really start to build some of those more like spear sharpening type workouts that are going to get me really fit to the point where it's not sustainable. So then I want to kind of time that just right so that I can fit that into that window, the race into that window where I'm at that peak fitness before kind of hitting the reset button and starting over.
Okay, cool. Very cool. And I love all things training and programming. So just picking your brain on some of this stuff, I find it very fascinating, especially from someone who doesn't really you have endurance athletes as a coach or anything, not to your caliber. So it's very, very cool to hear how you approach all of this. And how about nutrition? I've watched some of your videos from your website and kind of got some of the phases that you talked about and everything, but I'd love to kind of dive a little bit deeper into your nutrition as an endurance athlete and how you structure it around particular events.
Yeah. I have what I guess you'd probably consider a kind of fairly unique nutrition approach, although it's kind of gaining a little bit of popularity. But I definitely follow what I would call like a high fat, low carb diet. And, it changes a little bit depending on where I am in my training. And the reason for that is if I look at myself when I'm in my peak training mode, I might be working out like 20 hours a week when I add up all the running, strength work, mobility work, and all that stuff. And then, there's times of the year where I'm doing very little running, or the running I'm doing is unstructured and very low intensity. So when I look at myself through those different windows, it's almost like two different people. So I don't necessarily want to have the exact same nutrition protocol during each of those different stages. One thing I do believe in is that if you want to be able to really maximize your performance, you want to be a very good fat burner. And, from working with guys like, Dr. Volek and Dr. Finney, what I found is that nutritionally, you can get a lot more improvement on your ability to metabolize fat than say just trying to like go on what you call like a fasted run from time to time, where you're going on for a long run without eating before it and encouraging your body to burn fat that way. You can certainly make gains that way as well, but the amount of gains you can make are significantly higher when you also put that nutritional piece in there. So what I do is, that early stage, like when I was talking about that base training, or that aerobic development, those are the little lower intensity phases during my training. So those are the times when I have my carbohydrates at their lowest, like when I'm resting, recovering, or when I'm starting to kind of slowly build up volume, but staying away from intensity. And, that'll range from anywhere from like as low as 5% carbohydrate intake during some of those rest recovery, like low volume, low intensity phases. And then I'll let it drift up to maybe 10, 15% when I start getting into the higher volume, but still low intensity phases. And then when I kind of hit that third period of the training where I start to kind of keep my volume high, but then start to add in some of those intensity workouts like the tempo runs, progression runs, intervals, hill repeat type things, that's when my carbs will hit their highest point. And historically, that's kind of ranged from around 20 to 30% of my daily intake. And, one thing that kind of holds consistent throughout the entire thing is that fat is always the primary macronutrient in my diet. So even when I have my carbs at their highest, I'm still getting 50 to 60% of my intake from fat as my fuel source.
I find that very fascinating. So what spurred this? Because you've been a runner for a long time, I'm assuming you weren't always doing this, or maybe you were. What spurred you wanting to have this higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet in training, where it's not very popular in endurance training to really do that? You said it's gaining more popularity, which I've noticed as well, but for the most part, people are going carb heavy in these runs and stuff. So what spurred you doing this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's I think some of the like polarization of it is because people try to kind of go really far to one end or the other. They either want to go like no carb or like keto 24/7, or they want to go high carb and like, keep fat as low as possible. And then they kind of block out of their mind any of the middle ground in there. So for me, when I was in college and the first couple of years out of college, I was very much, a high carb athlete. I was open-minded enough that, I was reading the literature and stuff. So, but, most literature is going to say eat high carbs, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, that type of thing. And so I followed a very what I would call clean whole food diet, but it was very much, high in carbohydrates, like 60, 70% of my intake. And then once I started kind of really getting into ultra marathons, and hitting some pretty high volume weeks, I started to notice like that my recovery was less than ideal. Like things were like some red flags started to pop up. Like I'd wake up multiple times during the night to go to the bathroom. I'd have swelling in my ankles. I'd have these huge energy swings during the day. Like in the afternoon, I could have like laid down to take a nap anywhere in some situations. And, I started to kind of recognize those red flags as things that wouldn't be sustainable if I kind of kept doing what I was doing. And at that point, this was like, around probably midway through 2011. I started kind of thinking to myself, like, well, is my activity level unsustainable? Like, what am I doing here that can be fixed? And, one thing I recognized was I really enjoyed running and the training I was doing. So I didn't want to necessarily cut back on that. So I thought I would address something else first. And, the other thing that I really got interested in was nutrition. So I started kind of, diving into that stuff and, was really fortunate to, be able to contact some folks that had been like, deep into this type of research already, like I mentioned before, like Dr. Volek and Dr. Finney have been kind of crucial guys. And Dr. Dominic D'Agostino has been really pivotal the last few years in kind of putting out research and, explaining kind of like how to structure a high fat diet. And it was really intriguing to me. So I decided to give it a shot. And in the fall of 2011, I kind of started out by just kind of flipping my food macronutrient profile on its head and started favoring fats over carbohydrates. And one thing I noticed like pretty immediately was some of those red flags started to go away right away. Like I didn't see a huge performance gain immediately, but what I did see was I was sleeping through the night. My energy levels were consistent through the day. I wasn't getting that kind of that chronic inflammation or swelling in my ankles and stuff. And to me, that was like, okay, now we're heading in the right direction. And then it was just about, getting adapted enough and kind of figuring out how myself as my individual lifestyle, how that plays a role into like how I structure my nutrition. And that's kind of how I've been at it for, I guess, a little over 6 years now. And, I've definitely evolved from the beginning to now until how I kind of understand the best way to do it. And what I've kind of figured out for myself is that kind of periodized nutrition approach, that I explained earlier is what really works for me in terms of making it sustainable, but also giving me, the necessary fuel to kind of keep that competitive edge or maximize my performance without having like that end of the thing suffer either.
Yeah, and to be honest, your breakdown actually makes a lot of sense to me because, something that the high intensity or like fast twitch muscle fiber athletes find is that they try to go low carb and it doesn't work as well because they're doing these high intensity exercises. And it looks like you countered that. When you get into a high intensity phase, you increase the carbohydrates because that's what your body needs. And then when you're in lower intensity, higher volume, you have lower carbohydrates, which is, I think, really, really smart. How long did it take you to kind of develop this cycle?
Yeah, I've played around with it quite a bit in the last few years. And, when I kind of started doing the high fat approach, I didn't go like strict keto right away. But then, along the way, I kind of played around with that where I would go like strict keto all the time, like 5% or less. And, I've tried this probably 3 or 4 times at least during various training blocks just to kind of see if my body has adapted differently or respond differently. And, what I kind of noticed was like, you definitely lose, like you kind of lose a gear when you try to go full on keto all the time. And then so I started getting kind of interested in this like kind of theory or concept of metabolic flexibility where you get fat adapted enough to get to your goal, but you don't get so fat adapted that it comes at the expense of your ability to kind of utilize carbohydrates as a fuel source too. Because I think one of the misunderstandings with my approach is that people think that I demonize carbohydrates or I don't like carbohydrates, but really I love carbohydrates and I think they're a great tool. I just think they've been kind of prioritized or, they have a margin of diminishing returns. And, for me, that tends to be at that 20 to 30% when I'm in peak training is when I'm able to kind of still utilize carbohydrates when I need them, but not have the excess to the point where I'm getting all that oxidative stress and potentially like inflammatory processes that are keeping me from having steady energy or keeping me from being able to sleep through the night and things like that, which are big pieces of the puzzle in terms of recovery and kind of progressing in any type of sport.
And what does your nutrition look like during the race? Like the longer races.
The race, yeah. So that's where it gets interesting because I think a lot of people think that I'm probably eating a lot of fat during the race, and I kind of see it a little bit through a different lens in that. And the way I look at it is essentially you have kind of 2 fuel tanks when you're doing a race. You have your glycogen stores, is a very small fuel tank in comparison to your body fat stores. And a lot of times there's a misconception that like a really lean athlete doesn't have body fat or can't use body fat because they're too thin or too lean, and that's just simply not true. Like even the leanest athletes have enough body fat to get through an ultra endurance event. So like even if I get down to like 5% body fat right before a goal race, that's still my larger fuel tank. So one of the variables you're dealing with when you're running 100 miles or an ultra endurance event is when you're eating, you're creating a process your body has to do to digest. So for me, what I'm going to try to do for a race, I'm going to try to limit that process as much as I can without sacrificing performance, because I don't want my blood volume to be used for digestion if it can be used for cooling or muscle functions and stuff like that. So the fat I burn during race tends to be primarily body fat. I try not to eat a whole lot of fat. I want to take advantage of the fact that I've created like kind of a really high fat burning engine, and use that, bypass the digestive system during the race itself. I can always reload on, a lot of fatty foods after the race if I lose a few pounds during the event itself. So then the other thing that's left is that those glycogen stores, or the carbohydrate based energy, which, like I mentioned before, is that smaller tank. That's the one that I feel needs to be kind of like supplemented with during a race itself. So I'll take in primarily carbohydrates during a race, but they tend to be a lot lower quantities than what you traditionally see in guys and gals running 100 miles, and myself previously too. Like when I was in the high carb diet approach, I would routinely take in 400, even sometimes 500 calories an hour, and now I'm taking in probably somewhere between 150 to maybe 250 calories an hour, depending on the distance and the intensity of the race itself. And by doing that, I've been able to eliminate the amount of carbohydrate I'm required to digest during the race itself, because I'm just better at burning fat at various intensities than I would have been in the past. And then that smaller amount of digestion, I feel, helps with bypassing that type of a process during the race too.
And what's the primary form that you're taking in carbohydrates?
Yeah, so I've been using a product called X Endurance primarily the last few years, and they make a product called Fuel 5, which is basically like 4 different carbohydrates that release at like varying time frames, and then a lactate that so hence the Fuel 5. But I find that works really well in terms of kind of giving me a little bit of an initial pop of energy when I take it, but also kind of giving me a little more of a sustained carbohydrate source along the way too. And then especially when it gets hot, like electrolytes are important, so I'll take a product called Hydro X that's made by X Endurance as well, and that gets me that like sodium, potassium, magnesium type stuff that I'm going to lose, especially in warmer races.
Yeah, and how much are you drinking during like a 100-mile race? Because I know you have to stay on top of it, but you also don't want to overdo it. So where do you kind of fall there with hydration during these events?
Yeah, I try to operate a lot to thirst. I try not to like kind of overdo things by forcing myself to drink if I'm not thirsty. One thing I have found though, if you're not on top of your electrolytes, you tend to not get as thirsty as you maybe would if you have like optimal electrolytes. So, I try to keep those pretty regular to kind of make sure that I'm actually getting thirsty when I need the water or whatever it is I'm drinking. And it really comes down to the temperature on the day. Like, so for example, this race I did a week and a half ago, the Javelina Jundred, it got up to about 100 degrees when it peaked out. So, in the afternoon, I was probably taking in, upwards of 40, even 60 ounces an hour in some points. But then you'll have races where it kind of is a little cooler, where maybe it's only 70 degrees at the warmest. And, those type of events, I can usually get away with a little lower, like that 20 to 40 ounces an hour. And sometimes it depends on the distance too. Like if it's a race where I'm going to finish in like between 5 and 7 hours, I can afford to get a little more dehydrated because I'm just not asking my body to be out there all day long. Whereas if I'm doing a 100-miler and I'm going to be out there all day, that's where I have to be a little careful not to kind of ride that edge too far and find myself kind of, in a point where I can't catch up quick enough to stay at peak performance.
That's incredible, man. All this stuff, this information just in general, like you really have to be an expert on yourself to do well in these races, it seems.
Yeah, that's the exciting thing about it. I would say like, as an ultra marathon athlete, like one of my favorite things is the planning and is the variables. And, that is as exciting to me as the race itself, which, I think that's part of the reason why it's been sustainable for me, is because I really enjoy that process. I don't like loathe it. I like to look at what I did wrong or what things didn't work or what did work, and then kind of devise a plan or try to evolve in terms of trying something different if something's not seeming to work. And that's been a really fun part of the sport to me. And when you're looking at pushing limits for an entire day, there's just so many different elements and variables that play a part in that. It kind of makes it an exciting journey.
So think back for a minute and tell me about your maybe hardest race or hardest experience during a race or challenge you had to overcome during one of these ultra marathon races.
Yeah, so I don't know if I necessarily overcame this challenge, but I did would have been my second 100-miler in 2013. It's called the Burning River 100-mile, and it's a trail event, not a super aggressive trail event, but still a lot of like single track type stuff. And I had there was one part of the course, I think it was somewhere around mile 70, where you had to go up this little hill and stop in at an aid station, then come down. And there was a trail that went up there, and there was a trail that went around the hill, but they both kind of met down at the other spot where you get back onto the normal trail. And I had taken a wrong turn and went around the aid station on the base of the hill instead of going up there. So then when I got to the next aid station, they had asked me, they're like, I don't think you checked into the last aid station. And, so we sat there for a bit and tried to figure out what was going on. And, after a few minutes, I said, well, like, I had no clue what was going on at the time. And, so I said, I'm going to keep going. If you guys can try to figure it out and let me know at the next aid station what the plan is, or what has to happen with that. And so I got to, I think it was like mile 93. And the lady at the aid station, they had kind of figured out what had happened at that point, and they told me my options were to backtrack to mile 70 from 93, correct my mistake, and then carry on to the finish after that, or drop out. And I was like, I sat there and I was like, well, I came here to kind of compete for the win. I didn't really come here just to try to run 135 miles. And so I ended up dropping out. And it was interesting to me because I ended up kind of using that as a learning process, or like, a way to kind of like, understand the sport, that, it doesn't always play out the way you want it. Mistakes can happen, and sometimes they mean you run 93 miles of a 100-mile race and get nothing to show for it, really. And I kind of carried that into the end of the season, where I did an ultra marathon called the Desert Solstice Track Invitational. And at that event, I broke the American record for 100 miles and the world record for a distance run in 12 hours. And, I definitely was kind of thinking about all that stuff when I was doing that event. And, so even though it was not necessarily a win on the day, it was a big learning experience for me that kind of put me in a position to really want to kind of succeed and do well at the 100-mile distance.
Man, that's incredible. I feel like, being told that mile 93 that's tough. Yeah, that wouldn't be easy to overcome. But it pushed you to do a lot of great things, which is awesome. You overcame it and pushed forward. And what does your day-to-day look like right now? Are you a pretty routine individual? Train every day? Like, what does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, I'm usually doing something, even on like easy days or recovery days, to be kind of proactive with stuff. Right now, I'm kind of in a unique spot where normally I wouldn't do 200-milers within a 6-week time frame at the end of the year, but I was actually a little injured earlier in the year, so I haven't done a whole lot of racing. So I've planned the race I just did about a week and a half ago, and the one that I'm about to do in 4.5 weeks. And leading into the one I just did, I was at kind of peak training for quite a while, so I was hitting like that kind of 120 mile per week range. And I did a lot of my runs in the morning, mostly solo training runs, to try to really kind of get used to being on my feet for long periods of time. And then I have a few other things that I try to dive into a bit to keep things a little less monotonous with just kind of training. And I do online coaching, as well as working with some of my sponsors to do different things like group runs, or help out with events and things like that. So my days usually kind of differ from day to day depending on what aspect of that I'm focusing on, but I do tend to get my workout in first thing in the morning, and then kind of move on to some of the other stuff as the day plays out.
And what's your favorite type of event? Is it the trail stuff or being on like a track?
I would probably say like a very, very runnable trail would be my favorite, or even a very runnable, or even a road. The track is great for chasing times and chasing records and stuff like that, because it's just super fast. You don't have to worry about logistics, because you can get anything you want pretty much every 400 meters. But just from like really kind of enjoying the experience as opposed to, trying to get through it, I think like, I like to run. I'm not as excited about hiking a lot. So some of the real mountainous courses that require you to hike for large portions of the race, don't excite me quite as much. But I do like the trails, and I do like doing some climbing and descending. So as long as it's not so aggressive that I find myself having to power hike, a huge chunk of the race, that's kind of what I see as kind of the ideal event to train for.
Now I have a kind of a personal question. So I just recently moved from very flat part of Texas to North Carolina, where we have a lot more hills, mountains, things to run on. What kind of gear recommendations could you give me as someone who wants to start doing a little bit more trail running? Maybe start with some shoes, possibly. That's the one thing I'm definitely in the market for.
Yeah. The shoe industry, I feel, has grown quite a bit in the last few years to kind of specify for the environment you're going to go into. So, finding a good trail shoe that works for you, and I guess determining like where your preferences is in that. I know for me personally, I like a little bit more of a nimble, slightly lower profile type of trail shoe. So like I use the Ultra Superior quite a bit, because that has enough of a lug on there where you feel like you have good tread on some of the more technical sections. But it's nice and nimble, so I feel like my foot can really kind of get all that motion that it needs to stay nice and strong. Some people really prefer like a real heavier cushion bed, like a max cushion. And, for me, I work for Ultra Footwear, so I'm real familiar with their product line. We've got some stuff. One's called the Olympus, which is like a max cushion shoe. Another one is called the Timp, which is what I would call kind of an entry to max cushion, but it feels a lot like the Superior. So really, a lot of times it comes down to like what type of surface or terrain you're going to train in. Some people like to do what they call like fell running, where it's like really steep technical stuff, and they tend to do get shoes with like a little bigger lug on it, or something that kind of can really lock down on your foot really well, because you're going to be just doing a lot of like kind of weird, different angled impact forces. I could geek out about this all day long.
Yeah. No, I mean that's really helpful, because I'm very unaware, but about to make a purchase on some. So I'll check out what you're wearing. So the Ultra Superior, you said?
Yeah. That's my favorite trail shoe that they have right now.
Okay, awesome, man. Cool. And then any other gear that I don't even know about, I should have if I'm about to start trail running?
Yeah, so another company that I've been working with since I started ultra running is one of my first sponsors, is this company called DryMax socks. And they get really detailed into like the technology of socks. A lot of times I think people think like, well, it's a sock. How technically can you get? And it's surprising how technically you can get. And they do this demonstration on their website, and when they're at like events and things, where their goal is to remove moisture from your foot to prevent blistering, which can tend to be a big issue, especially when you're running on the trail, especially if it gets hot or wet out. And then what they do is they have this DryMax technology on the inside layer of the sock, and it's what it does is it kind of attracts moisture, so it pulls that moisture, or so it pulls the moisture off your foot, and the outer layer is what they would call like kind of like it clings to the moisture, so then it keeps that moisture on the outside of the sock as opposed to on the inside, where your foot would get wet or soggy and potentially blister up. A good pair of DryMax socks is a great way to kind of keep your toenails and avoid getting blisters and weird spots between your toes and on your feet and heels and things like that.
Awesome, dude. Well, I'm going to check them both out. Now I'm going to switch gears on you for a second, if that's okay. This is what we call the book question, and it just kind of helps me and everyone listening get a good idea of, I don't know, how you'd want to impact the world given an opportunity like I'm about to present you with. So say there's a nationwide curriculum implemented, and the president calls you up and he says you're responsible for one chapter of the book. So every single child in America will have to read your chapter, be tested on, and pass before they can graduate high school. What would your chapter be about?
Mine would be about open-mindedness. I feel like, for myself and training and kind of developing a plan, that's been my strongest asset. I'm not the fastest guy out there, or the most like, blessed naturally at running. But I feel like, keeping an open mind allows you to, instead of looking at like what's wrong with something or what is right between two things. Kind of allows you to look at two things that tend to work for different people and find out, well, what is the same about those two things, and kind of start from there, and then personalize and individualize it from there. So kind of keeping that open mind and, looking at things in terms of like a positive way, as like what's working in both these areas that are similar. And then, starting at that point, and then treating yourself as an individual, and kind of being honest with yourself. If something's not working, then, look to see if you can change it some way, or if something is working, try to find out why it is and what you can do to make it even better yet.
Yeah. And I think that open-mindedness has led to a lot of your success, with, at least being open-minded in diet, right? You mentioned that. If you hadn't at least been open, if you were, a little more dogmatic about, no, this guy got me into running and told me to always have my carbohydrates at 60% or whatever, maybe you would have never gotten to some of the levels that you have.
Yeah. It's definitely something that at least has brought me enjoyment in the planning process too, if nothing else. And it's an interesting thing, because you see guys and gals doing really well on high carbohydrate diets or on plant-based diets. Then you see folks doing really well on like super high fat type diets. And like I was kind of saying before, it's like, for me, it's like, well, what is the commonality between those two things? And I think the most glaring one would be like, a whole food process, or like an unrefined, unprocessed, unpackaged approach. And then you start from there, and then you can always make tweaks along the way to kind of personalize it. And that's kind of how I've gone about it.
And what did you call that earlier? You referred to it as metabolic flexibility?
Yeah, metabolic flexibility. And it's an interesting thing, because like, it's all this stuff is still relatively new. We have some good studies that kind of point to the pros and cons of, high fat diet and performance, but, there's not a lot out there that looks at that ability to kind of move between the two fuel sources. And, so I'm somewhat left to my own experience to kind of decide how that works. And, I've been told by people like, you can't do that and it won't work. But when I look at my training, like I find that when I'm, I can get fat adapted enough where I don't have to take in like tons and tons of carbohydrates and stuff during a race or during a workout. But I don't get so far away from carbohydrates that, when I try to do that fast workout, I can't get my heart rate up. So, to me, like, a study on that pointed that direction would be great, but I'm not going to wait around for that study to come out if I see it in my own training and my own like metrics when I'm training and preparing for a race.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. You're not trying to have the best training methodology for the human race. You're trying to have the best training methodology for you. And I think that makes a lot of sense to approach it that way. All right, man, are you ready for the quickfire questions of the show?
Sure, yeah, let's do them.
All right, what's the hardest workout you've ever done?
Hardest workout? Probably like 20 by 400 meters on track. It's just fast enough where like I have to like really dig deep, and 20 of them is just enough where like you get halfway through and you're like, what am I doing to myself?
And I bet you're trying to keep a pace for those, aren't you?
Yeah. Usually, for me, I think on that workout, I was trying to hit between like 68 and 71 seconds or something like that.
That's amazing. Wow. That's some speed for 400 meters over 20. That's incredible. All right, man. In your opinion, what's the best activity for building mental toughness?
For building mental toughness, I think doing something that you are not necessarily like, I don't want to say well prepared, but something that would normally cause you to kind of struggle with, and doing it for a prolonged period of time. I think just exposing your mind to kind of that, to that longer stuff is important. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be the activity you enjoy the most, but, kind of breaking some barriers in what you would consider like feasible in your own mind is a great way to kind of reshape what you perceive as possible. So, for me, I notice it a lot if I don't do a race for a while, or if I don't do like a structured long run before a race, where like it's like, even though I've done, I think 40-ish ultra marathons, like I still need to do a few here and there before my goal race, just to kind of remind myself what it's like to be out there for that long and strengthen that mental sharpness and keep that kind of in a place where you don't necessarily doubt yourself.
I have a question for you and this isn't one of the quickfire questions, but it just popped in my head with all that you were talking about. A term that we use a lot with my athletes and in this community is meet yourself. Meeting yourself by, doing some sort of workout that kind of, it breaks down all of your your forward defenses that you normally have in life, because you just kind of get torn down, and then you are just, and it's no one else is there. It's just your kind of mental state. You're like not necessarily beat down, but you're fully aware of who you are. That person who wants to quit, the person who starts talking negatively, all these things start to pop up that don't normally pop up when you're 100% primed and everything's good to go. Would you say that you get to that point in every race?
No. I get to it, but I don't always succeed at kind of pushing through it. It's one thing that I think if you have when I think of the races that I feel like I've really nailed, they're the ones where I'll come up on that, and then rather than kind of sliding back into that, okay, this is all I have, I'll take what I can get, or quitting, that's kind of that breaking point, I guess, where you have to kind of redefine what you feel is possible or what you feel you can do. I would say you get to that point certainly in every A race. And it's really hard to say, I've had races where I have really poor finishes in the latter half of the race. And it's hard to say necessarily if it was, a lapse in mental strength, or if it was just not quite being prepared or being fully recovered for the event or something like that. But, one thing that does stand out to me is when I do nail a race, I find that I have an easier time kind of staving that off or working through those situations, as opposed to kind of being succumbing to them.
All right. Awesome, man. I really appreciate that. All right. If you could only have one piece of equipment to train with for the rest of your life, what would it be?
One piece of equipment to train with. Let's see, probably a pair of running shoes, I guess. Though I'd have to be pretty picky about where I ran, I guess, then. But yeah, I think the running shoes is probably what I would pick first.
Awesome. And how often do you get a new pair of running shoes?
I would say I cycle them. I like to follow what I call a shoe quiver approach, where I'm using maybe 3 different pairs at any given time, and I'm kind of rotating through them, because one thing I focus on is kind of that lower leg, below the knee strength. Those muscles in people I think have gotten a lot weaker over time, a lot of times due to footwear choices and things like that. So I like to kind of wear a different type of shoe, expose my muscles to that type of a structure, and then kind of switch to a different one and kind of fully develop all those areas. But then at the end of the year, when I kind of count up how many shoes I went through, I'm probably looking at around 12 or so, 12 to maybe 13, 14 pairs.
Okay. Wow. Awesome, man. All right. The last question of the show. What is the best advice you have for becoming a better human? And this is 100% open-ended.
Can you say that again? The
best advice you have for becoming a better human, and it's 100% open-ended.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so I think, I would definitely revert back to my chapter in the book to the president about keeping an open mind. But I think with that comes looking at perspectives from other people's, experiences, because really if I look at someone doing something completely different than me, the first thought is, why are they doing that? That doesn't work. But then if I catch myself early enough, it's well, how do I know that they didn't go through this long process and figure out that works really well for them? So trying not to kind of have that first judgment or that first kind of notion of they're wrong, I'm right. Instead, thinking with a little more of a bit of curiosity as to, I wonder how they came about that, or I wonder what causes that process in their mind, and trying to understand it from that angle.
I think that's great, man. All right, what's the best place for people to learn more about you and what you're doing?
Probably on my website at at zachbitter.com. That's where I kind of post a lot of like my blog posts, and I'll pin some of my YouTube videos to that. But yeah, and the links to social media profiles are there too, like Instagram and Twitter are ones you can kind of see a little more of the day-to-day stuff that I'm doing, whereas the website is probably kind of a more of a holistic, like how I've evolved from when I started to where I am now type of a resource page.
Awesome, man. I know it's been a blast talking to you. I've learned a lot. So I really appreciate you being on the show. Any parting shots or anything else for the listeners you got?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on. It's been great. And then lastly, I think to listeners, try something new, keep an open mind, and learn from everyone around you.
Awesome. Love it, Zach. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, thanks again.
Your best. Losers always whine about their best.